Watch out.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Second works. We're going to go ahead and get started with our next panel. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our panelists this morning. Up first, we have Dr. Michelle Marcus. She's an environmental epidemiologist and the lead scientist with the Michigan PBB registry, which is now maintained by the Raw School of Public Health at Emory University. We also have Dr. Alma, who conducted laboratory experiments showing that PBB produced birth defects in mice and was the first to warn the public not to eat contaminated farm products and advised others not to breastfeed their babies. He's also the author of 2 books about the PBB disaster, Cancer and Chemicals, and I believe he has his most recent book with him as well, PBB and PBB and Environmental Disaster, Michigan Chemicals Poison Reverberates 50 years later. And then our last panelist is Dr. Eric Morgan. He's a professor of natural resource management at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan. He teaches classes and conducts research on the economic, policy, and social dimension of natural resources, including ecosystem services, energy, and commons. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started on our panel discussion. So, one of our first questions, we've heard a few of our topics already about environmental justice, but I was hoping the panel could talk a little bit about that and how it's relevant to the PBB disaster. So, hand off to Dr. Marcus.
Hi. Thank you, Robert. Can you hear me? Okay. So our last panel talked a little bit about environmental justice and gave us a definition. Nicholas Dixon, are you still here? Disappeared. Okay. So what I'd like to do is expand a little bit on that definition because I think an element that's really important important is the element of power. And, you know, the wealthy and powerful rarely have, you know, polluting industries in their neighborhood. You know, in this instance, you know, the chemical plant was sited here, and as Ed Lorenz told us, there were many individuals in St. Louis and downriver who did not want the chemical plant put here because they anticipated the pollution that might result. And if you listen to Gary Smith's oral history on the Alma podcast series, he talked about the fact that it was clear to everyone in the community that the river was being polluted by the chemical plant, that the fish were dying. Everyone knew not to eat the fish in the river. And yet, the community tolerated it because of the perceived benefits of the jobs and the economic benefit. And so they were not able to change that equation. They didn't have the power to force the company to be more responsible about handling this toxic chemical. And you know, the other important aspect of this is that the children, and we have seen that there are health effects among the children of people who are exposed. They never made that choice, and they are powerless to control their own exposures. And when you can see that some of these chemicals, PBB included, can actually have impacts for multiple generations, you know, when you're trying to sort of weigh the economic benefits against the problems that you might face, or the risks that you might face. It's one thing for an adult to make a decision to work in a chemical plant, but their children didn't make that decision. And you know, communities that have suffered the effects of pollution, unfortunately, many times that pollution can last for generations, or the health effects can last for generations. So I think there are, you know, two important environmental justice principles here. The power to control the economic development so that it is not causing so much harm. And the second is the unintended consequences on multiple generations, and that can really perpetuate the disparities in risk and the harm that comes from the chemical plant. You know, the other aspect of the power is that not only were the citizens not able to stop the plant from locating here, and not able to force them to be more responsible, but when the farmers discovered the problem with the PBB mix-up, they were, as we've heard so clearly, they were blamed and shamed, and the government agencies that are tasked with protecting, you know, the agricultural industry, protecting the citizens of this state, they didn't do their job. And not only that, but they were protecting themselves and allowing this additional harm to perpetuate. So I think those are two important aspects of why this is an environmental justice issue.
derogatory term. And I think, and then also Donald raised the question that how could people be so stupid? They must have been paid off or something, some good reason for it, to allow this to happen and let people eat poison for 4 years. How do we get around this? I think what we have to do is be very careful who we elect to public office. Oftentimes they choose their friends, their family, their political allies, or whatever political agenda they have. They choose people who are unqualified to do the job, and when that happens, disaster happens. Whether it's in government, in state government, whether it's in business, or whether it's in the federal government, you have to be able to rely on people in high places to make the right decisions and do the proper thing. I think we need to be very careful who we elect in public office from now on, and even perhaps make it mandatory that people placed in high positions, such as department heads in government or in business, in charge of controlling certain aspects of the business, they have to have the proper background, education, experience, and honesty to do the job that they're appointed to do. Otherwise, we're going to pay a very heavy price. More disasters will happen unless properly qualified and honest people are put in these positions.
So, the previous panel alluded to some discussions of economics, and Dr. Lawrence mentioned that we might get into that here. So, I think bringing up environmental justice is appropriate now. So, in economics, we think of primarily focused on economic efficiency in cases where the benefits exceed the costs. And as an environmental economist, we spend a lot of time trying to quantify and monetize those, the environmental damages, the environmental costs, what is the economic value, the monetary value of endangered species or human health impacts and things like that. So really the focus is on efficiency, but that comes, really the economics profession is largely neglected justice and equity, how those benefits and costs are distributed across society. Economists just say, well, that's for policymakers or other social scientists to figure out. That's not an economic question. We're just focusing on the benefits and costs. So then, and given the power, Dr. Marcus talked about power, economists and agencies for economic development, they have a lot of institutional power. So that focus on economic development, on efficiency and the benefits and costs really has come at the expense of equity and justice concerns. And those are finally, entering conversations now after, decades of people advocating for this. They, people that are advocating for environmental justice finally have a seat at the table now. So I want to reiterate that economic efficiency is itself a value, right, as well as a science. So economists like to put on the hat that we're scientists, we're objective, and there are scientific and objective questions that can be asked. But then that application of efficiency is a value-based decision-making lens. And so we need to bring in equity and justice into these equations, into the decision-making process much more explicitly and much more upfront. And given that, the Michigan Constitution actually enshrines environmental justice in Article 4, Section 52. I've written out a copy of that section. It says that conservation and development of the natural resources of the state are hereby declared to be of paramount public concern in the interest of the health, safety, and general welfare of the people. The legislature shall provide for the protection of the air, water, and other natural resources of the state from pollution, impairment, and destruction. So the legislature, the Michigan legislature, like Tom was saying, has a responsibility. They shall provide, they must provide for the protection of the air, water, and other natural resources for the health, safety, and general welfare of the people of Michigan. So we really need to help hold them responsible. So I'll turn it over to the next question. So thanks.
Thank you all. So one of the next questions I think has come up a couple times throughout the conference thus far is, what can we do to change laws and policies, given that it is enshrined in the Michigan Constitution? What policies need to change, or what things do we need to change to prevent future disasters, like the PBB disaster, from happening? Happy to start with whichever of you wants to start.
So I'm not a policy expert, but I really do think that there needs to be a sea change of understanding about the environmental damage that is being done, not just to our planet, but to ourselves. And I believe that it is the community that is ultimately has to seize that power. And I think we've just seen a wonderful example of it here with the Pine Rivers Superfund Citizens Advisory Board, that they've been able to hold EPA accountable in terms of cleaning up the Superfund site, and it's because of their persistence and their knowledge that this is now finally proceeding to be a really comprehensive cleanup after 2 failed remediations. And I think that that's the only way. I don't know the specific policies that need to be enacted, but there has to be a groundswell of understanding among the population that, again, that we're all bearing the risks of these industries and getting very little benefit, whereas the wealthy and powerful are consolidating their wealth and power.
Well, it's up to the people to make the change. I'd like to read a quote. I have a chapter on the Superfund site in this book, and I started out with a quote by Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And I think that's a responsibility of holding our leaders, people who make all the important decisions regarding our environment, regarding our food supply, and in general, just the country's benefit in general, hold them accountable to make the appropriate decisions. And I furthermore think that when these people are appointed, they should be held to competitive examinations to make sure that they have the background, the knowledge, the experience, the honesty, and also the intestinal fortitude to make the hard decisions. Without that, we're going to have further disasters.
Some of my work recently has been building on the work of Eleanor Ostrom. Ostrom was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on collaborative environmental governance. And that theme of collaborative solutions has been coming up in some of the discussions today. Kate Master mentioned that in the last panel. So Ostrom was a professor at Indiana University, and her work was, she was a political scientist who was interested in how people come together to solve resource management problems, but more generally really interested in how people self-govern, right? Really critical questions of democracy and self-governance that often express themselves in these natural resource using communities. So Ostrom's focus was on these what we call commons or shared resources like fisheries and forests or shared pasture, things like that. And so she actually got her start not in natural resources, but in municipal governance. She did a number of policing studies on what's the optimal size of the police department. This was in the 60s and 70s when there was a lot of emphasis on consolidation, potholes, kind of street lighting. Really, what's the optimal level of governance for providing these municipal services? And she found that large consolidated police departments didn't really serve the people well. It was the smaller police departments and smaller units of government that often were more in touch with the people, that were more responsive to the problems, and people had more say in how their communities were governed. So building on that, right, that these public services in general are not really imposed by the government, but they're co-produced by the people and the administrative agencies, right? Co-production is a critical theme in Ostrom's work, especially in policing, right? We can't impose law and order on a community. Real public safety comes from this interaction. It's co-produced by the community members themselves, along with public safety agencies. And I think we can see that theme happening here in public health and environmental health in particular. That environmental health is not imposed, it's not just the responsibility of the administrative agencies. It is their responsibility, but it's not only their responsibility. That the people, citizens, have to be vigilant and responsive and participating in creating public health and co-producing public health. And I think we've seen that so many times through the last 50 years of the PBB case. I can made a note, there was the Oral History Project where they said that, this was a quote from one of the University of Michigan documents. The oral histories conducted with Michigan residents nearly 50 years after the largest contamination of farm animals and the food system of Michigan highlight both the dearth of formal scientific knowledge about the effects of human health and impacts at the time, and the essential role of community science in building knowledge about the source and exposure and its human impacts. So really that citizen science has played a huge role. We heard some of those stories today. Another paper coming out of that same team recognized the mobilization of community skills and resources in an effort to build knowledge to inform action to protect public health. So really, what we see here is a validation of Ostrom's work, this idea of knowledge co-production in the field of environmental health. So, and Ostrom said that these, self-governance is messy, it's hard to do, it doesn't work all the time, but we can't just, wait for someone else to solve the problems, right, and impose a solution on us. It really takes, the community to work together and collaborate for shared governance and creating environmental health conditions. Thanks.
Hey, I have one last question for the panel, and then we'll open it up to y'all to ask questions. So, last question, we talked a little bit about through this conference about health, and not only the health of humans, but also of the environment. I was wondering if you all could just briefly talk about what you think the long-term implications for health and the health of the environment from the PBB disaster and other environmental disasters that we're seeing.
Well, so in some ways, the PBB disaster is unique in both its scope, how many millions of people were impacted by the event, and also the amount of toxic chemical distributed throughout the state. And because of these unfortunate things, and because of the strong community action, the state, with funding from NIH and CDC, was able to develop a long-term registry to chart the health impacts of this terrible disaster. And I have been honored to work with all of you in order to determine what the risks are, the long-term risks of this exposure. And we're here today because 50 years later, 6 out of 10 people we tested in Michigan still have elevated levels of PBB in their blood. And then there are health impacts for the children and the grandchildren of people who are exposed. But I don't think that is unique. I think that there are a lot of other chemicals that are impacting our lives, and the chemicals that persist in our bodies and in our environment will be with us for decades, for tens of decades. And we are still making more of these synthetic chemicals that do not break down in our bodies, that stay in our bodies for tens of years, for decades, and in the environment for decades. And when I was a kid, we used to talk about throwing things away. There is no away. I mean, here's EPA, haul it away. Yes, they'll haul it away and they'll put it in a place where a landfill that is hopefully sealed and it won't leak. But how many landfills can we have? And so much of the toxic chemicals that are in commerce end up in regular community landfills, and then they pollute the groundwater. I forgot the question, but this, we're going to have this problem for many generations, and we need to figure out how to solve it. There's now in the ocean, chances, there's so much plastic in the ocean that chances are that the fish that you eat, ocean fish, contain plastics. You're eating plastic. We are recycling the plastic in our bodies and in the animals that live on our planet. And we're still making more of it.
I have 2 areas that I would like to cover now. One is environmental justice. What would be the appropriate thing to do for the people so affected nowadays? If you're aware of the asbestos workers in the past, they are known to get several different types of cancers, the most prominent being mesothelioma and lung cancer. They are required now by law to be given the opportunity for annual physical examinations with periodic chest x-rays to have early diagnosis for any of these cancers, so they will have the best opportunity for a good outcome. What should be done with the farmers and their families and the people of St. Louis? We should have clinics established to periodically examine these people. They are, it looks like, most likely to have higher incidences of gastrointestinal type cancers, lymphomas, breast cancers, and other cancers that may pop up in the studies as they move along here. These people need to, and should have the right, environmental justice-wise, to at least, since they've been exposed to these chemicals, to be able to have an early diagnosis of any problems that may develop and be provided appropriate treatment at no cost to them. It's not been done, but I'm hoping that someday it will be. The second thing I'd like to cover is we've heard some heartbreaking stories today about problems related to reproduction. We could cover a lot of different topics and spend a lot of time talking about the various environmental diseases caused by PBB and the other chemicals. We could talk about cancer, we could talk about neurologic disease, we could talk about endocrine dysfunction. But I think it would be appropriate today to talk a little bit about reproduction problems. I don't know if you are aware, but the average male sperm count in developed countries has dropped from 50 years ago. The average level was 100 million sperm per cubic centimeter of fluid. Today it's below 50. It's dropped by over 50%, and male infertility is becoming to be a major problem. What is the reason for this? It's because during the formation of sperm, and it also occurs with egg formation, chemicals can interfere with the normal developmental processes of these cells being formed. There are very delicate chemical processes involved to create sperm and eggs. There can be genetic damage to either one, and it can be carried on for future generations, we are now finding out. That's a relatively new finding. Once conception has occurred, the new cell is really a biological supercomputer. It has DNA that is unique to anything ever been produced, and in that DNA are millions of apps, just like on your computer hard drive. There are millions of apps waiting to be turned on or turned off to provide the appropriate chemical environment for the different organs and tissues to be formed. And it's a very delicate dance that has to be performed in precise rhythm and precise progression of sequences for things to occur normally. What happens is if a newly formed human cell is, everything is normal DNA-wise, at that point, it starts dividing. It divides to 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, 32, 64, 128, up to thousands and thousands of cells to form a little ball. And that little ball eventually has a little ridge form on it. That ridge forms the brain and the spinal cord. And if we talk about the formation of the brain, you can compare it to a marching band at a football game. They come out on the field, they're all together. Once they start moving onto the field, what happens in this ball of cells is these cells start to differentiate. Their apps are turned on, and they are made to migrate to different parts of the brain to form different types of cells. They form neurons, they form supporting cells, and other types of brain cells. And this all has to take place in a very delicate sequence. If we compare it to the marching band, if some of the band members were a little high when they went out on the field and they didn't do their job right, or they've been drinking all night or stayed up all night, they're not going to perform very well, and they're going to mess up the formation. The same thing happens with an embryo in the formation. If we take just the brain, these processes occur with all the different organs, but the brain is probably the best one to illustrate it. They go into various formations. The marching band will go to different parts of the field, they'll play different notes. But to make a comparison, if the people in the marching band forget their notes or they forgot their music, you're going to have a terrible formation and it's not going to work right, it's going to sound terrible. If you compare that to what happens in the human brain, it's essentially the same thing. If there are damages or interruptions to this normal sequence, the brain is not going to form right, and you're going to end up with a kid that has a learning disability, maybe autism, autistic, may have other developmental neurological problems. And this is brought out by the fact that 10 to 15% of newborn children now are, worldwide, are born with some kind of a deficit that will show up earlier in childhood or later on in life. If these sequences are badly disrupted, it may just cause the death of the fetus and you'll have an abortion or miscarriage. So what causes these interruptions? It's the toxic chemicals we're talking about. PBB, PCBs, you're probably aware of the drug thalidomide, what happened with that. Thalidomide prevented the turning on of the proper app at the appropriate time to form the limb buds and to form the limbs. And as a result, since that didn't work, you get kids with either without any extremities or with very deformed extremities. And this is just an example of what can happen with these toxic chemicals in terms of reproduction. It's a terrible thing, and we need to be warn women to be very careful about what they eat. There are a variety of different chemicals that we are in common use, particularly the recreational drugs. Cocaine causes severe brain damage. There are a number of other ones, just for example. And there are drugs that aren't tested for this, but yet we're taking them. That's how thalidomide was found out. It was used as an anti-nauseant, mainly in Europe, and was given to women back in the 60s. And it was later, they reported a whole lot of birth defects. I think there were 15,000 cases of children born with abnormal limbs or no limbs at all. So I'm just pointing this out as an example of what these toxic chemicals can do to us and what's going to happen to us in the future. It's going to affect our brain development, it's going to affect our thought processes, and it's going to affect probably our culture and evolution itself in the long run with these toxic chemicals. Because it's not only affecting our species, but other species as well. So we have to be very careful about what we're exposed to and try and keep our exposures at a minimum, especially for women who are pregnant. We're finding now, for example, that women who were breastfed during the PBB program, the female offspring who were breastfed during the PBB crisis, Dr. Marcus and her group have found that they have a higher incidence of breast cancer now, just for example. But anyway, what I'm trying to point out is that these chemicals can affect a pregnancy, can affect people for the outcome of their lives for their entire lifespan. So it's extremely important that these chemicals be tested and that women do everything they can when they're pregnant to avoid these toxic chemicals. And it's even now recommended if you're planning on having a child that for 2 to 3 months prior to conception, you refrain from these drugs that are known to cause these defects, because if it affects the sperm or an egg DNA, it's going to affect the fetus as well. So if any questions about development or embryology or whatever, that answers the questions.
I just want to add something to the thalidomide story. Tom mentioned that thalidomide was used widely in Europe. Why was it not used widely in the United States? Because of a very responsible official at the FDA. And her name was Frances Kelsey, and she was the first woman to be in a high-level position at the FDA. And her first name was Frances, which was a common name for boys as well. And when she was offered the job, they thought she was mad. And she faced so much pushback when she said, we cannot approve this for pregnant women in the United States. I am not going to approve it because the animal studies show that it can cause deformities. And she was attacked she was subsequently awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor. But these are the kind of honorable, knowledgeable people that we need in positions of authority.
I think one of the optimistic trends that I see, one of the hopeful trends, is the rights of nature movement. So this is in the field of law, actually. Our focus in the Constitution of Michigan says that it's the conservation and development of natural resources are paramount public concern in the interest of health, safety, and general welfare of the people. So our legal system is really focused on human health, which is incredibly important, as we've been discussing. And then, in the 70s, the golden age of environmental policy, we kind of shifted towards, endangered species are important too, and we're going to protect those, but it's kind of a, one species at a time approach. There's an emerging movement called the Rights of Nature movement, which seeks to give legal standing to elements of nature. And one example of this was in Toledo. The city of Toledo had a referendum, and the people voted to give legal standing to Lake Erie. Now, Lake Erie, was considered dead in the 1970s because of so much industrial pollution. It's come back a lot since then, but it still faces problems, toxic algal blooms, and this rights of nature movement in Toledo said that Lake Erie has, it should have the opportunity to thrive as an ecosystem. And the people of Toledo should have the right to represent that the lake should have legal standing, and people should be able to bring a lawsuit against polluters on behalf of the lake. So it seems kind of crazy, like, wow, this lake, this ecosystem, this element of nature could have legal standing. And it passed. Unfortunately, a state judge in Ohio threw that out. They said, well, Toledo is just a little bit of, Lake Erie, so you can't claim to have legal standing for the whole lake. But this is just one example of of this rights of nature movement that's happening all over the world. That the idea that elements of nature, beyond just a single endangered species, but large elements, whole ecosystems, have a right to exist, and that people can, sue on behalf of the lake, represent them in court. It sounds crazy, but we also have legal fictions like corporations. Corporations aren't a real thing. They're constructed entities, legal entities that we give rights to, economic rights, political rights, legal rights to corporations. We can do the same thing for elements of nature, and that's something that's happening all over the world. That's something that could happen to the Pine River, for example. If someone, one of the organizations here, could sue on behalf of the Pine River for its, for its right to exist and thrive. I think that would be an interesting thing. So that's kind of a trend that's happening around the world. It's happening here in the Great Lakes. And if we could have more of that, I think that would complement the public health rules and laws that we have. Also the environmental, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all those landmark environmental laws. This rights of nature movement could complement that in a large way. So I'm kind of optimistic on that trend. Thanks a lot.
Just looking at the time, I think we have time for just one question. Go.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel for their knowledge and expertise in sharing that with us this morning. I have actually a question that pertains to pre-disaster, if I can phrase it like that. And if we can go back to 1973, this is a public policy economic issue, where I think the real heart of the question, or guarding and draperies and everything to prevent fires from expanding so rapidly, actually in households. And the previous chemical that was manufactured in the building where PBB was manufactured was DDT. And that was manufactured because there was such a huge demand for that pesticide. So the question becomes, when the federal government, or let's say public policy, conflicts with what might be environmentally or health-wise appropriate, you got a real conundrum because Michigan Chemical at the time was making as much flame retardant as they could, because every company that manufactured something that had to have flame retardant needed it. And so my question center is, how do you get to that issue, okay, the creed? Because nobody knew that PFAS is a current example. Yet those people that were with the fire departments, I guess, at airfields or whatever, they didn't know. Maybe Wolverine Worldwide did in Grand Rapids, I don't know about that, but I think that's a real critical issue. How do you get at this sort of natural conflict that exists? Thank you.
It's a great question.
So much of our policy making is siloed, right? So you have, this is a very narrow problem, we're going to have a very narrow prescriptive solution to that problem, right? So, how do we prevent fires in houses? Well, we have flame retardants in the materials, right? But we don't really look at policy making in a holistic way. We test individual chemicals. It's hard to test for how these things are interacting with one another. So, I mean, I guess that's the limitation of policy making. How do we get around that? I know the website for this event talked about the precautionary principle that we should, take more, try, as much as possible. Well, the burden of proof, basically, the burden of proof is on the manufacturer to show that this is not harmful, rather than kind of assuming that this is generally going to be not harmful, and then look, it's up to, the community members to show that this harmed me in some way, and then it needs to be regulated. But as our science and how, manufacturing prowess becomes more sophisticated, it's how you have all these chemicals. How do you test everyone, and then the interactions between all of them and the environment and human health? I don't have a good answer, I'm sorry, but maybe Dr. Marcus does.
It's not impossible. I think we have learned so much about how the chemical structure and the properties of a chemical that we can get pretty good at predicting. We know whether a chemical is going to be persistent in our bodies and in the environment. And there is a Stockholm Treaty where many nations signed a treaty agreeing not to make any more persistent organic pollutants, and PBB would be one of those. The United States has not signed that treaty. So that's one thing, is that we know about persistent chemicals. There's a new movement called green chemistry, where new molecules for particular industrial purposes are being designed specifically so that they are less toxic, and specifically so that they degrade in the environment. So we're not stuck with this PBB, the DDT, that is hanging around for hundreds of years, and the PFAS. call forever chemical, but it's very similar in structure to PBB, and we know that that carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest bond known in chemistry. There is no reason why we should continue to make PFAS when we know it will last virtually forever. It is degraded so slowly, and when they have a PFAS cleanup, the only way to destroy the PFAS is at much higher temperatures than are being used at the Superfund site here, because it is so much stronger. It has to be incinerated at very, very high temperatures. Now, there's a lot of research going on now, other ways to break that bond and degrade it, but we're still making it. So I think that there are a lot of chemical principles and toxicologic principles that we know that we can, in fact, predict what's going to be more toxic and what's going to be less toxic and what's going to be more persistent in the environment and what's going to be less persistent.
Fortunately, our battery just died.
Can everybody hear me?
We have extras. Is there one there? Yeah, try that.
That one's for show.
That one's for show? Oh, that one's for show.
I think we should share. Okay, we're back in business. To follow up on what Dr. Marcus said, the additive chemicals, including chlorine, bromine, fluorine, and also iodine, are what's known as a halogen group of chemicals. They don't occur in nature normally. They're all man-made for the most part. And if you take for example, PBB, there are numerous sites on the biphenyl molecule where you can add either chlorine, which would make it a polychlorinated biphenyl. If you add bromine, it's a polybrominated biphenyl. I have not heard so far of anybody making a polyfluorinated biphenyl, but they probably haven't thought about it. But in each case, there are numerous sites, and you can have one or more bromines or chlorines or fluorines on different positions of the molecule. So what I'm getting at is that there are many, many different types of polychlorinated or polybrominated biphenyls. And each one has its own different toxicity, whether it has one bromine, two bromines, 4 or 5 bromines, or however many there are. And depending on which position they are in each case, you can end up with hundreds of different possibilities, and each one has its own toxicity. So it's impossible to perform studies on each one to see what its toxicity level might be. All you can really do is, from what we know now, how toxic these are, is ban the whole group. Now what happened with Firemaster, it was a polybrominated biphenyl, and that was finally banned from production. So what they did, the Velsicol sold the chemical brand name Firemaster to another chemical company, and although they couldn't make polybrominated biphenyls, they made brominated phenols. They cut the molecule in half. They took one 6-carbon ring and put bromines on it, and they're marketing that as Firemaster. It's probably worse in toxicity than the polybrominated biphenyls. But they haven't tested it yet, and I don't know if there are plans to do so, but it's probably worse than PBB. So it's impossible to test everything. It costs thousands of dollars to test each one, many thousands of dollars to do the appropriate testing, and it's just impossible to do them all.
Thank you. I really appreciated what you have to say. And funding is a big issue. And as far as the law, there was a federal judge in Detroit that had ruled in favor of the CAG group. And I think Gary Smith was instrumental in that. And I'm wondering if Gary would just tell that little story, because the funding that they had received, I guess today helps even sponsor this, so it was a fairly significant amount at the time. So, Gary, would you be willing to tell that story? I also might say that Gary is a 3-time champion of the Independence Open golf tournament.
He's not exactly accurate on that. I am at any rate, the story he's referring to is all right, remind me, because I'm really bad at this. It looks so easy when everybody else does it. Anyway, the story he's referring to is a number of years ago, and I don't know how that pertains to what we're really talking about right now, but had the Regent seen somewhere where there was a liability, environmental liability policy in place for a company that was going bankrupt here, who had actually purchased a company who had donated a bunch of chromium and lead and different things into the river under a natural resource damage program kind of thing that the policy was written for. So that says, well, it's a $100 million liability policy. What do you think we should go for? You know, everybody's like, that says, let's just put an X in the box for $100 million. And so we did that, sent it off, and it was a bankruptcy proceeding. So it come time for the day in court, and what we wanted to do was file for an extension because we didn't know what we were doing. And so Ed and Murray Grillo were going to head down to Detroit, but on the day that they were having the court appearance, Ed and Murray were on their way to Canada or somewhere, actually Colorado, I think, and they were crossing Kansas, and they called in and said, hey, you are in jail, you guys got to go. And, like we know what we're doing. And so I dug out my cleanest, dirtiest white shirt, put on a sport coat, and tried to look like an attorney, you know. And Jade and I headed to Detroit, you know, we're going to go to the bankruptcy. And we had a local news reporter that she came down on her own. So we ended up in the courthouse, you know, and we're waiting our turn. And there was all these miscellaneous kind of claims against them that the lawyers were saying to the judge, you know, well, the judge had to either, he had to ask them, do you approve this or disapprove? Well, every response was, well, no, we're not paying it, we're not paying it, we're not paying it. And so we sat there all morning, and then they weren't ready for us. So we went and had some lunch, went back in the afternoon, and they finished up with the miscellaneous claims. And the very last one that this person had to get dismissed was a handwritten letter on like a stenographer pad, you know, where they had a line down the middle of the paper and that kind of thing. And it was from a little old lady that had retired, and she had either bought a refrigerator or a new washer and dryer or something of that nature, but she still owed a couple, $300 on this stuff. And part of the bankruptcy thing they were going to do was take away, there's a way where they could take like 45% of your pension. So she was concerned that she couldn't make the payment. So she was asking for forgiveness. She was asking that they would just pay off her thing for her, and that was all. And so he's reading that off, and And the judge had glasses on, and he kind of looked over his glasses now. After he read it, he looked at the lawyer. You want to forgive this one? Yes, sir. We're not paying it. I mean, he was kind of like, he threw his chest out. You sure? Yes, sir. The judge didn't have a choice. He had to. So then, that was it. Now it's our turn. So we're following that, all of this, and we're thinking, man, this doesn't look good. So we get up there, and, we're standing there. Here's Jane, about this tall, and me, we're standing there. It gets started. And Judith Greenstone Miller, I'll never forget it, standing pretty tight to me. She's the lawyer from the other side. And she's known in Detroit as one mean lady. And she never loses. So they get us all started, however they do it. And pretty soon the judge kind of looks at us and says, are either of you an attorney? No, sir, Your Honor, I'm not. And Jane sits there. She had her hands folded in front of her. She says, no, Your Honor, just citizens. And it was a Hallmark moment kind of thing, And so, we're nervous. I mean, it's pretty scary in that courtroom, let me tell you. Even though we weren't there, we were on the right side of it. And so the judge looks at us and says, I regret to tell you, but in order to be in federal court, you have to be represented by an attorney. Well, Judith knew that, right? She's a pro. So she's over here just we're going to get out of this. And so, boy, so Jane and I, our chins hit our chest. Oh my gosh. So anyway, so I said something to the judge. Like, well, Your Honor, we'd like to apologize to you in court. We never would have wasted your time. And he looks at us and he says, well, you just hold on. I'll tell you if you're wasting my time or not. And this guy's got a lot of power. You can just feel it. And so he looks at this. He had three, court officers, a couple of ladies on each side. One in the middle says, hey, who's the next firm that you're flipping over like this? Who's the next law firm that's got some pro bono attorneys? Well, Judith over here, kind of heard her wheezing or something. And she was breathing hard, and she was starting to hyperventilate or something. And she's not happy, so she started to say something, and the judge just looked over his glasses at her. You were kind of one of those, he cut her on and done it. Well, she shut right up. I mean, she just, and so they gave us two attorneys. They gave us a 60-day extension, as I recall, and gave us instructions. And he looked great at Judith the whole time. And by now, she's starting to salivate. She's really hot. She's not happy. And she had three other attorneys next to her, and they're just helping her, I guess. And it basically told us that, you guys get your attorneys together. You get with it, and I want to see you in here the next time, and I want you to have some answers how you're going to do this. And so here we're sitting there, we get $100,000. And then he looks back at us and he says, now, even though you put an X in the wrong box, which was Ed's fault, but it was a moment where he says, we're going to allow this. So this is for natural resource damages, and we had absolutely zero standing at all. That's a legal term we use that you're eligible to do what you're trying to do. And we're, Jane and I, we're 10 feet tall. All of a sudden, we're feeling like, wow, we did good. And so we walk out of there, but Judith, she slammed out too. She slammed that old door, and she said, we're calling her out of there. And here goes, what was it, Rosemary. Rosemary Horvath was the reporter. And it was just like on TV, she had a little cap on, pencil in her ear, and she's got her back beat around. Judith, we didn't comment. I was followed her in out of here. Just slammed that old door, and she was, oh God, she was mad. That was a moment. That was fun. And so, fast forward, we got the attorneys, we hooked up. They knew all about this, and they were young, brand new attorneys just hooked up with the firm. And they're nervous and everything, but you know, we made them feel home. You know, we welcomed them into our family of community advisory group people. And so this went on for, I think it's several months. I don't remember how long. And so there's a pile of money there at stake right now. Really, you know, $100 million. I mean, that's like a big number. And so they went back and forth, and then the day finally came, and they went in front of the judge, and the judge, when they conceded, they named Judith. I would have liked to have been there to see that. I would have. We got a judgment for $1 million. Wow. Well, that would have been great if they gave you $1 million in bankruptcy court. Just because you got $1 million judgment doesn't mean you can get it. So they have some funny math that they do. And when it was all over with, we were a couple $100 short of $100,000. And with only one stipulation, use it for natural resource damages. And it was just on your own, you know. There was no accountability or anything. And that's what we've done. We got lucky, but sometimes you make your own luck. And we, you know, one of our philosophies is like 50% of everything we do right is by accident, and the other half is pure luck. But we try to pick up every rock and look under it, and not be afraid to ask the question. And maybe we did a good answer, maybe we did not that. But we don't know what we don't know until we try to find out what we don't know. And so the same thing applied to this, going into the front of the judge. And if there's a place that you can go and ask for some help like that, or try to get something done, just do it. That's what we try to do. And it's worked pretty well for us. And pure heart, pure spirit, pure purpose. We're about as transparent as it comes. If you tell the truth, you can just forget it, because it's always going to be the truth. So really, that's the story, and we've used it a number of times, in a number of ways, that we can't use our technical assistance grants for. And they've served us well every time we've used it, and we've benefited from it every time. And you know, I say we, the community, cleanup, the projects that we're working on. So all this out of